everybody, welcome back. And we are in week 12 of this course, believe it or not. Can you even, like, 3 months? Incredible. So now, of course, you're all Salesforce experts. So, you know, no pressure or anything. But today's session, what I wanted to take you through is to start looking at some of the non-functional stuff around release readiness, release management. And then on Wednesday, we'll look into sort of consoles and some of the other cool features that you can make use of in Salesforce that are more platform oriented. Then we'll take a break for a week. And then when we come back, we will start doing Service Cloud. And there'll be some interesting projects coming up, because in that week off I'll be able to take some time to write up some projects for you to work on and so on. So hopefully you're still with us. Thank you very much for joining every single week for the 12 weeks. It's lovely to have you with us. So today's session is about sandboxes and release management. And in order to explain this, there's a few drawings that I'll have to do. There's a trailhead module that we can go through, and there's a little bit of showing as well. So I'm just getting my Lucid chart up and ready to call upon if we need it. You know how I like to draw pictures. And let's have a look. So I think the most relevant trailhead badge that we can look at right now is a trailhead badge that's called Change Set Development Model. So I'll just show my screen and I will put a link in the chat for you, and we can start going through this and then contextualizing it as well. I wonder, it might actually also be worth just opening up my org just so I can very quickly and securely at a glance just show you what I'm using that for, and just give you a little bit of context maybe. So can you see my screen, lovely folks?
Yes.
Thank you. Right, okay. So change set development model. And I'm copying and pasting into the chat for you. So into Trailhead, off you go. Probably less hands-on this one, more about learning. Now, with Salesforce being a multi-tenant and cloud-based platform, what that means is it's always alive, and which means it's never ever finished. If you think about Facebook and Twitter, there are new features that come out regularly. And sometimes they'll make changes to the way that users experience the platform that are rolled out to everybody. Now, Salesforce has obviously a lot more going on, so they actually invest a lot of time to continually improve the Salesforce platform. So there are a number of different things that we have to consider if we're rolling out Salesforce, because as we know from all of the training that we've been doing, it's very easy for you to go and create fields and change page layouts and produce automation and write reports, etc. The hard part of this is about the when, the how, and the why around that. So there are a number of recommended methodologies that you can take on board when you're setting up Salesforce. The reason that we actually talk about application lifecycle management and change sets and all of those things is because it's very easy to get lost in the configuration that you're building. If you think about what's in your Trailhead playground now, could you honestly remember exactly what functions you have built in your Trailhead playground and why? Possibly not. So the reason that we have application lifecycle management is so that we can put some structure around that, so that we can ensure that the users that come after us understand why we made certain design decisions, but also to actually report back to you know, because Salesforce is often used across many different functions and structures, so it's a strategic investment for a lot of businesses, and they want to know that, you know, the money that they're investing in the application and the configuration of Salesforce to the business's requirements is being well spent. So how do you track that? Well, you track it by putting some structure around things. So there are a couple of ways that we can, and I'm just going to talk about the technical ways that we can look after Salesforce and make sure that we're keeping our releases nice and structured. In a brand new implementation, it can sometimes be really tough to think about how you're going to set this up. I mean, best practice is you can spin up what's called a sandbox. And a sandbox is a copy of your Trailhead playground, for example. Your Trailhead playground, for all intents and purposes, is actually an org in its own right. And we actually call that the production org. So when somebody, hang on, I'll start again because I'm getting myself lost. I'm going to start with some key terminology. When you have been working in Salesforce and you have a live org that contains data that users are logging into actively and are updating data and so on, we call that the production environment. Production environment because people are producing data and insights and actively using it. Now, production, generally what you tend to see happening, and it's not always the right way to do it, and it's certainly, you have to make a bit of a judgment call at times. There are plenty of projects I've worked on where it's a brand new implementation and we have just configured straight into production in order to save time, okay? Or because we're working with a managed package and that managed package needs more data than can be supported in a test environment. So there are lots of reasons that people build directly in production, and you have to kind of weigh up the pros and cons of working in production. I mean, for a brand new implementation, the pros to me are that you just configure once, you load the data once, and you're away. The cons are that once you've done it once and you know how much easier it is, there's a real risk that you could end up just continuing to build things in production and you haven't actually tested anything for any new functionality that you're building. So I suppose the other disadvantage of building and migrating directly into production is that if something goes wrong, there are a few gotchas along the way. And certainly if you're loading data if you're doing a big data migration, if I heard that a customer was going to do a complete data migration straight into production, I would probably give them the side eye. In fact, I might just walk out the room. Because if you do it straight in production, you've got no way of rehearsing. You don't actually necessarily know, because you haven't tested it in an equivalent environment, how that data migration is going to go. Now, and this is around sort of the first time you implement. Once you're live and you've got users in that production org, a general rule of thumb is you should not be changing anything to do with configuration in there. You could change list views and reports. You could change data. You might, change somebody's, you might change a user and put them onto a different profile or a different role, but you should not be doing any major changes in Salesforce in a production environment when users are in there. And if I find out you do, I will find you and kick you. So where can we do our changes? Well, you've heard me talk about sandboxes. There are different types of sandboxes that you can use. There is, first of all, a full copy sandbox. Guess what that is? It's a full copy of your production instance. So this goes into there. So that's all of your metadata. And can anyone remind me what metadata means? Right back to lesson 1. Data about data. Yep. Objects, fields, data of data. Correct. Yeah. So objects, fields, flow definitions, validation rules, page layouts, lightning record pages, reports, dashboards, list views, folders, public groups, sharing rules, all of those things are metadata. So with every sandbox that you produce, all your metadata will be copied down for every single sandbox. What makes full copy sandboxes so special is that it will also copy all your data down as well. So it's an ideal staging environment. It's an ideal test environment for minor fixes before you put them into production. It gives you a way of testing with zero impact on users, because all your users are actually quite happily running around. They're quite happily up here in production, and they're logging into production and using production. Whereas down here, you might only have just one admin or a couple of developers, etc. So that's the big difference. That's the real advantage of using sandboxes, is the minimal impact that it has, because all your users are up here. Whereas down here, you've just got maybe one or two, and you're actively building and testing. Now, other types of sandboxes you can have. First, you can have a partial copy sandbox. And partial copy sandboxes have a little bit more space in them. You can refresh them more often, because with full copy sandboxes, you can only refresh every 29 days. And with a partial copy sandbox as well, you have to produce what's known as a template in your production org. So in your production org, you can actually say, when I refresh a sandbox, I am going to refresh it according to this sandbox template. And in that sandbox template, I might take down all of a copy of all of the data that's in the contact object, or in the account object, or I might just take down leads, etc. It depends on what you want to actually refresh down. Now, you can't refresh a partial copy sandbox without a template. You've got to build some kind of template. So partial copy sandbox, you can basically, it's just a sample, so you could use it for quality assurance tasks like UAT, user acceptance testing, or integration testing. So if you've got several different work streams, several different development work streams going on at once, you can pull them together in the partial copy sandbox and just make sure that they aren't breaking each other. And you can also use it for testing integrations with other systems before you deploy into your full copy sandbox. There are some links. There are actually some limitations as well. There is a limitation on the amount of storage. And there's also limitations on the number of times that you can refresh and how often you can refresh. Because if you think about it, you are copying data off one server and putting it on another server that doesn't belong to you, it belongs to Salesforce. So it costs money to them, which is why, sandboxes can be fairly expensive if you rack up enough of them. So Sandbox Limits. Okay. I've mentioned a developer sandbox, and this is typically, you get loads of these when you have a production org, and you can refresh those pretty much once a day. Let me just double check that, because it'd be just like someone to call me out and go, "That's wrong, Gemma." Yes, because they change all the time. But the idea is that your developer sandboxes, it's basically a sandpit for individual people or individual teams that do not contain, they don't allow for a lot of data to go in there. And for developer sandbox, yes, you can refresh once a day. Let me write that down here. Refresh once a day. Refresh means you make a copy of your production metadata and push it down into your developer sandbox. And then you basically can log in and add all your own individual data into here, and it doesn't affect what's going on up here. Make sense? Cool. There we go. So you're working, here's my full copy sandbox down here. I could have several people in there if I wanted to. Now, developer sandboxes, they also have 200 meg of file storage and 200 meg of data storage. That's a lot. So you got to be careful. You would use that just for, building and testing things. And then if you wanted to test it with a bit more data, you would deploy it into here, into a partial copy sandbox, ready to be tested and ready to go ahead with other people's stuff that they've built. Because ideally, what you want to do is give one of these to every developer, really, so that they can play with it, or one of these to every single development team, and you have them all kind of pooling into that one place. Okay, making sense, everybody? Yeah, okay. Blah, blah, blah. Developer Pro sandboxes are like developer sandboxes, but you can have a bit more data. You can have 1 gig of files and 1 gig of storage at the time of recording. It can change. Okay, so Developer Pro Sandbox. So this is where you might want to test with slightly larger volumes of data. So if your developer is down here and thinks that she's a little bit fancy, she can get herself set up with a Developer Pro Sandbox and hope nobody notices, or not. She could get herself set up with a Developer Pro Sandbox because she needs to test with 1 gig of data as opposed to 200 meg. Sometimes with managed packages, where managed packages are reliant on custom objects as settings, sometimes that can cause your sandboxes to fill up. So it's another good use case for Developer Pro Sandbox. Partial copy sandboxes. So your partial copy sandboxes, the limits for those, you can have the same file storage limit as your production. So it's your prod storage. And 5 gig of data, which is why it's ideal for UAT, because ideally for UAT, you would have several users going in there and testing what you've built for them against the requirements that they've given you. In an ideal world, in reality, you get all sorts of excuses from people as to why they're too busy to do UAT. Sorry if I sound a little bit cynical. Okay. Making sense? So you've got, Gemma over here, Gemma over here writing some code, and then once her code is ready, she can pop it over here for someone to test. If they're happy with it, then they can put it, then you can actually deploy into here so that you can do a dress rehearsal and bring your data migration in. And then when you're ready with your changes, you can deploy it up to here and everyone starts, using your beautiful functionality. So there's several ways. Let me just check if I covered everything. So full copy sandbox, that's the same, basically same as production. Same storage as production. And you can refresh every 29 days. Be careful, be strategic about when you refresh your sandbox. Partial copy, you can refresh. How often can you refresh it? You can do it every 5 days, 5-day refresh. And then refresh daily for these two here. Okay, clear as mud? So, when you create sandboxes, how is the data importation handled? Is it automatic? Well, I'm about to answer that one for you. So just to really quickly recap, whenever you refresh a sandbox, it refreshes from production, and it copies, always copies metadata. In terms of actual data, if you refresh a full copy sandbox, it always copies the data as well. And if you refresh a partial copy sandbox, it asks you to define a template, and then the data that you've put into the template will go down into the sandbox. This is metadata. Metadata. Okay. I hope this helps. I don't think I've ever drawn a diagram of this so quickly. Anyway. So, what do you do with these sandboxes other than just, you know, how do you actually even go and create them and get them set up? Well, I'm going to show you very briefly in my production org. This is my production org. And as you can see, yeah, I'll put this diagram on for you, Jason, no problem. And everybody else, not just for Jason. Kat says, what's UAT? UAT stands for User Acceptance Testing. So if you build a flow and you want people to experience that flow, then you spend time building it, and then you deploy it into a sandbox, and then you get those people to log in and perform user acceptance testing. And to do that, all they do is come into your homepage, and they look at the requirements that you've got in a special script, and they work their way through what you've built for them, and then they give feedback. Yes, I'm happy with it. No, I'm not. You need to completely change it, or could you just change this and that and the other a little bit so that, you know, so that it meets the requirements better. So it's the user's chance to actually assess what you've built for them. So if I was UATing in here, you know, the work I do in this environment, sorry, the work I do in my production environment is live, whereas the work I do in my sandbox environment is just happening inside the sphere of that sandbox. So it doesn't affect anything else. So how do I even go about getting a sandbox ready, right? We've talked about it conceptually. In my production org, I just have to go and type in sandboxes and click on there. And then I get a view straight away of what sandboxes I am allowed to have. Now, the sandboxes that you are allowed to create are based upon the edition that you have of Salesforce, and also, you know, whether you've actually bought, you know, access to more sandboxes, you know, for extra money, because you can buy more sandboxes. Now, if you are on unlimited edition of Salesforce, you get a free full copy sandbox with your subscription, included in your subscription. And as you can see here, this in our production org, I don't have any full sandboxes available because I don't have unlimited edition. Now, I can upgrade to unlimited edition if I want to. I just don't need it yet. My business doesn't need it. Partial copy, I have one. I'm allowed to have one partial copy sandbox with my subscription, which is in use at the moment. I don't have any Dev Pros, but I can create 25 developer sandboxes if I want to. So I could have 25 admins like yourselves or developers, you know, actually going into copies of my org and producing work in there. Let me just check. I have one sandbox template, and in here, all I've done is just say the objects that I want to take data over for. So it's pretty standard. So I've just said I'm going to bring over, you know, an object. I'm going to bring over my accounts object. So basically a copy of data that's held in that accounts table. Same with architect skills and certifications, assignments. You can spot the custom objects I've created. I want to take down a catalog of certifications and skills that I use to track my architect's experience. I want to bring down my contacts, and I want to bring down opportunities as well, and projects and various other things. So all this is doing is just making sure that if I need to test something and I need actual data, I don't have to then go and set up, you know, all this data just so that I can test one thing. It just enables me to test much quicker. And once I've and as you can see, I've actually used that template once to copy down to my tic-tac-toe sandbox. Now, to log into a sandbox, there are two ways you can do it. One is to log in directly from here. There are other things I can do with sandboxes. I can clone an existing one. I can delete it. I can refresh it, bearing in mind that if you've got stuff that you've configured in this sandbox and you click refresh, it will completely overwrite the work that you've done. So if you've done a lot of work in there, you're going to be very upset if someone overwrites your sandbox. And that has happened to me before. I went kind of crazy. But luckily, you know, I only lost about 2 hours work instead of, you know, 2 months work. So if I'm working as part of a team that is creating, if you're working as part of a team that is actually creating the functionality that's needed, communication is absolutely key. And we talk very carefully about this as in the context of governance. How do we make sure that what, you know, Susan is configuring over here doesn't conflict with what Adam is building over here, and Adam doesn't overwrite Susan's work, and Susan doesn't overwrite Adam's work, and nobody refreshes on top of it so that everyone loses their stuff. So the governance of a project around Salesforce becomes very important, because we have to talk about how do we control that? Who do we nominate for that role? Or is it a role, or is it a set of duties? And how do we make sure everybody gets exposed to this concept so that they can learn from it and take it forward? Anyway, you can also log in. You can log into the sandbox from here, and you can also log into the sandbox by going to test.salesforce.com. So if you're working with two environments that look pretty much the same, how do you even know and remember that you are in production versus sandbox? I'll show you. I'm going to log into my tic-tac-toe sandbox. Now notice I've got my username, and then I've got a dot on the end, and then tic-tac-toe. Tic-tac-toe is the name of my sandbox. And then the password is just the same password that it was in production the same password that it was in production on the day that I refreshed it down. Now, Jeremy has a good question. If you have a very large object, can you bring over only some of its data? Well, let's have a look. What you would expect to do is to be able to filter certain objects and just say, give me objects where it's this or that. I don't think you can do that. I think you have to just choose an object and get it down, unfortunately. So no, it's an all or nothing. Something else to consider as well that you can have, and this is more important when you've got data privacy laws and compliance to consider. So if you're in Europe or California, and you have the Data Privacy Act, it's actually more often than not now, it's a requirement for us to anonymize data that's in the sandboxes, because let's say somebody exercises their right to be forgotten, which means they don't want you to keep any data about them at all. You need a quick way of wiping that or anonymizing it, so that you can still maintain your insights, but you just can't identify that person. You need to be able to do that in every single environment where you hold data about that person. So for very large banks, for example, they'll have loads of different systems that have a record of Gemma Blizzard. And if I phone them up and say, I don't want you to hold my data anymore at all, they've got to erase it or anonymize it on every single platform, including all their test environments. So Salesforce came out with, there was a recent release of a feature called Data Mask for Sandbox. And it's effectively just a feature that you can use to secure that that sensitive data. And it's a managed package, and it just runs a script on all the data that's personally identifiable, and then completely hides it. And there's a trailhead character trailhead badge that you can use here, so you can replace data with scrambled numbers and letters. or you can replace sensitive data with random data using some libraries here. So you could choose like fake names and things. So it still enables you to summarize useful insights and to keep some history, some level of history. But it's just that somebody can't be identified from it, and that's where the compliance rules really are. So through this route, we go to test.salesforce.com and we click login to Sandbox. How do we know we're in the Sandbox? Well, one, it's a bit slower. The Sandbox servers are a little bit slower than production ones. It's just something that we accept. And yeah, another reason for us implementation partner to, you know, extend estimates, I guess. Something else that I need to tell you about as well. Across the top, you've got this ribbon that appears and it says Sandbox, and it tells you which sandbox you're in. If you compare that to production, you don't see that at all. Whereas in Sandbox, you will always be able to see that. Now, if you're lucky enough to have 2 screens and you're doing a deployment, I actually really like to see, I like to have Sandbox open in one window. Oh my God, I better change that. You know, Sandbox open in one window and production open in another. And it helps you, and you know, just looking across the top here is an important part of that. Now, I want to tell you about something else that's really important. Salesforce has 3 releases a year. We have spring, summer, and winter releases. At the moment, we're on summer 20. And then in the latest part of this year, we will be on winter 21. And then next year in the spring, it will be spring 21 and then summer 21. And then it kind of resets in the later part of every year. Everybody gets the same features when Salesforce does a release. And if you are certified in Salesforce, you have the option to complete release trailhead modules so that you can learn and test yourself on the new features that are being released. There's no way to switch releases off for individual customers. And believe me, I have worked with people who have contacted Salesforce and escalated and said, you're running a release this weekend, we don't want it in our org. And Salesforce has just gone tough. You know, that's how it is. Everyone gets, one of the benefits, right, is that everybody gets the same improvements. It also means that everybody gets the same bugs, but there are intermediary releases that come out sort of behind the scenes that we don't know about. If there's a major release, we know about it because we get notifications if you get the admin emails, but also when you log into your org, it will tell you when there are planned changes. There is one other way that you can find out what's happening with the release schedule. Salesforce has a site called trust.salesforce.com. On this website, you will be able to see when the scheduled releases are planned for. You will also be able to see a system status. And there are 3 main areas that you can look at. I don't know if you, hopefully you can see it. I'll zoom in a bit. It's basically where you go if you've, the way my brain goes is someone says, oh, this is really slow. You know, I don't know what's happening with Salesforce today. So I might go and look at how is the sharing model set up? Or what was that person actually doing when they're saying it was slow? How much data is involved? And if I can't see any reason for concern, I'll then look at what kind of instances, what kind of server is their org sitting on? Is it production or Sandbox? Then I will come here. I will come to trust.salesforce.com and try and find out which server they're on and find out if there's any issues going on with that server. So you always get a status, like overall. There have been a couple of times when things have been locked down completely in response to a threat or an issue. There was an issue called Permission Gate, which is quite famous amongst the community now. I think it happened about a year ago. When there was a script released, and it basically got rid of a bunch of people's settings off of their profiles, and it wasn't just one org; it was like loads of orgs on the same server. So in order to rectify that, Salesforce, because it could mean that actually, you know, if suddenly everybody's got permission to do everything, that's a huge security risk. So they shut down the entire server while they fixed it, while they rolled everything back to what it was. And that's probably the first time I've seen a big issue on Salesforce systems for quite some years. But you know, they dealt with it very, very swiftly. It was up and running within a day or so at the very most. Anyway, if you ever want to know stuff about how Salesforce keeps data secure, so to satisfy your infrastructure architects and engineers, then you can come here, and all the information that you need to know about security is all here as well. There are best practice guides. There are release notes for the next. That's a bit out of date. There are release notes for the next release. There are trailhead badges that you can complete. And then there are security guides, engineering blogs, Salesforce Shield, and things like that. So where you can log that information. Now, as you can see, there's a lot of servers that are used that support the Salesforce platform. We've got status.salesforce.com, which is the main platform. You've got Heroku, which is another web-based development platform that Salesforce bought a few years ago. You can check the status for that. For data.com, for Datarama, for Click Software, that's the e-commerce platform. MuleSoft, which is an integration middleware package. Pardot, which is for marketing. And Tableau, which is for analytics and visuals. So obviously it talks a lot about what Salesforce does in order to keep things secure and compliant. And it will tell you server by server. So if we go to learn more and look at the status of salesforce.com, on this page, you'll be able to see which servers, if any, have had issues, where they're hosted, if there's any incidents that are going on. So there's obviously a COVID-19 update, if there's any ongoing maintenance, and then you can split it by individual product here. So if I want to look at Sales Cloud, I can click on Sales Cloud and it will tell me what instances is Sales Cloud hosted on. So these are all the instances, and they're generally prefixed by regions. So EMEA will start with EU, Americas will start with NA, and Asia Pacific will start with AP. And then CS is where your sandboxes tend to be hosted as well. So you see sandboxes and production orgs are all on different instances. The UM ones, I think they are developer editions generally. And this list becomes bigger all the time. So if we look at what instance am I on? I don't know actually, because I have my domain enabled. Let's have a look at CS79. We can see the current status, so everything's kind of split out and how's it working. And then history, you can see by like the last 7 days history. So there was an incident last time. There's a ticket here for analytics, which is now resolved, caused by release activity. So somebody broke something when they released it due to an unexpected fault after the release completed, you know. And it tells you how long was the performance degradation there for, and it started in the morning, and you know, people couldn't access it, etc. So they are very transparent about where things have happened, and you can, you know, it's helpful if somebody's been impacted in some way, you know, it helps you to raise the risk and to make decisions on how to handle that risk. So for analytics, it might have meant that the impact is that you can't access the data, you can't run reports. It just means that, you know, people have got to wait for their reports for a little bit longer, or use a Salesforce standard report. So that's how you look at what's going on with the status. Now with sandboxes, obviously I can see straight away in here that, you know, I'm testing in that environment, and we use sandboxes in order to help manage our release. Now, there are different ways that you can transport metadata and data between orgs. As you know from the last few weeks, we can use the data loader to export data from one instance and import it into another. That's easy enough to do. You can also use what's known as a change set, and a change set is a way of deploying metadata. And you would use the change. What you basically do there is you collect up all of your functionality that you've built. Oh, I haven't finished talking about that anyway. You collect up all the functionality that you've built and you add it to a list, and the list is called a change set. And then when you're happy with it, you upload that change set to another instance, and then you go into that other instance and you click deploy, and it will run some tests, and it's mind-numbingly there's a really good gif of it actually, but it's a very frustrating thing to do, is to use change sets, because I actually find my mental health gets better if I just accept that my change set isn't gonna work the first time. Anyway, and you deploy it. So here's my sandbox, and I've done some change sets already. So what I have to do is actually create a connection between this sandbox and production. So the way I do that is I come into my sandbox and I go to deployment settings, and I create a sync basically. So I say, what do I actually want to synchronize this sandbox to? I want to synchronize it to my production environment, right? So I can click edit there. And I can say, look, I can actually choose whether I want to allow production to send stuff down to me, right, to this sandbox. You notice that says accept inbound changes, and I can't change outbound changes, and I can't change that. That's because that box is actually ticked in my production environment and not in my sandbox. So I'll show you. I'm in production now. You can tell because I don't have the banner going across the top. I go to deployment settings, and I can see, what am I allowing to come from wherever. So for tic-tac-toe, if I click edit, I can tick allow inbound changes, and what that means is anything that I want to, any change sets I want to run from my tic-tac-toe sandbox are allowed to, they're permitted to be uploaded into this environment. So let me show you what I did before. Change sets. Now there are two types. You get two items here in your menu here. If you're deploying out of your sandbox, then you need to create an outbound change set. If you are trying to deploy a change set that's come from another environment, then you go to your inbound change sets and you deploy from there. And every org has these two options in it, sandbox and production. So if I go into outbound change sets, I'll be able to see the history of a couple of change sets that I have uploaded into my production instance. So for example, here I created a flow called assignment date. So if I click on that, I can see that I uploaded this to production on the 3rd of June at 3:07 in the afternoon. And this is what was inside it. There was an account. There was a field called account on the project object. It's a custom field, and that's its API name. And if I click view source, I can actually go and look at it in my org itself. It'll take a minute because it's a sandbox. So I can add pretty much anything I want here. So you notice I've got custom fields, I've got actions, I've got list views, I've got custom objects, I've got compact layouts, I've got page layouts, validation rules, I've got a couple of flow definitions in there as well, which is, I've also got a pick list global value set. I've got a record type, and I've got page layouts, and I've got a lightning page, and I've got a flow version. So this is my actual flow that I produced, and I've just added it to my outbound change set. Now, once it's been uploaded, I can't change it. But look, this is what the XML looks like to describe the field that I've made. This is just a simple file. So what does that mean? It means that if you are familiar with development tools, it means that you can actually download this metadata and you can deploy it, and you can store it in a central repository, and you can use continuous integration tools to integrate, to move your stuff over instead of using a change set. And many distributed teams do that. Okay. So, and this is actually what you're looking at right here right now is metadata. It talks about what is this item called, what are the elements for it, you know, and I've just pointed and clicked and dragged, and it's produced this single file, which is the flow itself, the actual flow definition that's been added into my change set. So the other thing that I've done here is I've added 2 profiles. And the reason I've added profiles to this change set is not because I want to move the profiles over as well. It's not physically possible to do that. What you can do, what you do instead is you include the profiles that are important because you actually are bringing over the settings for the items that are in your change set. So the timesheet costs field, the timesheet date field, they all have profile settings. You remember when you open up when you create a custom field, it says what profiles do you want, which profiles should be able to see and touch this field. That's the settings. And if you don't include these profile settings, you end up deploying all this stuff and there's no field level security on it and nobody's got permission to look at it, and it's not on any page layouts that you can see because you've not deployed the permissions with them as well. So top tip, use your permissions and remember that you're not copying the whole profile, you're only copying the settings for these items here that are in your change set. So when you are ready to deploy, and I've actually got a couple of change sets in progress here that if I upload, it's not going to break anything. It's just going to make it available. And then I've got to hope and pray that nobody decides to deploy it anyway. So in here, I've created a change set. I've added my 2 profiles because that just comes, I've been bitten so many times now. It's one of the first things I put in. I create the change set, I add the profiles, then I add the stuff. And the stuff I've added here is just a flow. And if I right click on it, it will take me to the flow itself so that I can go make changes to it. And any changes that I make, because I've not uploaded this change set yet, it will just, you know, it will just be live so that when you do upload it, it will be the finished one. You can make changes to it and know that it doesn't change it in here. Something else you've got, when you click add, you're given a great big long list of things that you can deploy by type. So if you look at this drop down, you've got actions, you've got approval processes, you've got assignment roles, you've got letterheads and email templates and compact layouts and custom data types and custom report types, custom settings, dashboards, reports, flows, folders, groups, you know, all of this stuff that is called metadata you can bring into your change set. So if I was going to, so I added a flow definition. If I just uploaded that, it could fail because if it can't find any, if I've created any new fields to support this flow definition that don't exist in production yet, and I try and deploy that flow without the field, it's probably going to create an error because it's going to go, hang on, you're referencing a field and it's not in this file and it's not in production. Blah, break. So you have this thing called view and add dependencies. View and add dependencies shows you what other functionality, what other metadata in your org this flow relies upon. And you can see that there are 133 elements here, as you can see here from this menu. And you can see, you know, what is the item and why is it referenced? Well, it's referenced by the project object. It's referenced by the project retro. And the project retro appears on the page layout for a project, and the project page layout is where the flow definition sits. So you see, it just kind of creates this daisy chain, and it says actually you need to be able to, you should deploy all this stuff. You don't have to, but you could be there running and rerunning it, and getting error after error until it finally deploys and you dance around your living room and throw champagne at yourself when it works. So these are all optional. You don't have to add them. Worth noting as well that if you have any managed packages in your org, you're not going to be able to deploy any of those changes because they'll be in your production org anyway if your package versions are the same. You know, so don't worry too much about managed items. Oh, sorry, I've been talking a lot, so I'll start yawning when I talk. And then once I'm ready, once I'm comfortable and satisfied that I have included everything, and believe me, there's many times when I haven't, and I've had to go back and clone an existing uploaded one so that I can add it in, like, I don't know, a field. You just upload it. And it says, what tests do you, where are you going to upload it to? Here's the target organization which has the connection, because you've gone into production, you've said allow inbound changes. So it comes up with all of those options. You can deploy between sandboxes, and you can deploy from sandbox to production. You can deploy from production down to sandbox. You can refresh from production down to sandbox, which is different. You know, loads of stuff you can do here. If I hit upload, now I'm not going to deploy this live in my org because I might cry. But you notice it says it's in progress. We'll send you an email when it's complete. It can take a while, but even though it now says that the change set has been uploaded successfully, it might not actually be available to deploy yet, not for at least half an hour, depending on how much you've got in there. So back into production, there's another option here called deployment status. And this is where you can see what happened with the various inbound change sets that you tried to deploy. And you can see here that actually some of my deployments failed, and you can look at the errors and you can try and understand why it failed. Most of the time, if there's an error, it's either because there's something missing or there's something in there that shouldn't be. So I tend to, or there's a setting. In this instance, my one of my flows, my dashboards broke because, you know, it was missing. There was a setting switched on in Sandbox which wasn't in production. So let's go and look at our inbound change set. So you only use this in the target organization. When you've deployed a change set, you go into the target org and you go into inbound change sets. Makes sense, right? And it will tell you, here are all the change sets that have been deployed and what their status was. And here is a change set that you're trying to deploy from Tic-Tac-Toe Sandbox. And you can click validate, or you can click deploy. Validate is a test deployment. It will actually run it will actually run tests for you. So if people have written a lot of code and you need to test against that code, ideally you should have tested against that code before you got to this point, please. But it still enables you to do that for production, because in production you'll have a lot more data than you would in your sandbox. So it needs to run tests to make sure that it doesn't break anything. So validate runs a script, a deployment script. If all is well, then you'll be able to deploy it. Now there's something I want to show you. I want to show you something that you see in Salesforce. There's this really random graphic that appears like when you deploy items into Salesforce. Let's see if I can find a little video. It's called the deployment fish. No, nobody's done it. Okay. The deployment fish is this very, very random graphic. When you're deploying from a change set, it will tell you how many. It will actually tell you how. It will tell you how many components have been deployed successfully, and it will create this little weird diagram that looks like a fish, and it will kind of move around. So you'll get the green starts moving one way, and then eventually it will create little fish shapes. And then hopefully you will get this lovely message at the end which says validation has succeeded. Here are all the deployments, the components that have been deployed, and we've run the Apex tests and we've got 13 out of 13. But in the process of it deploying, this graphic kind of wiggles around a little bit and you end up seeing different shapes, and one of those shapes is a fish. Now, there is actually this is my friend Todd. Todd runs a website called Shirtforce, and they create Salesforce-based t-shirts, and all of the profits go to charity, and it's a different charity every quarter. So they create, and these are all designed by people in the Salesforce community. So somebody decided to make a fish bowl and put the deployment fish in the fish bowl. And if you want to take part in this, you can design t-shirts as well. If you want to, you can just send Todd your t-shirt designs, and he'll put them onto a t-shirt for you. Their FAQs are absolutely brilliant, but you can see, you know, there are a lot of Salesforce themed t-shirts here. Someone even designed a trailblazer hoodie which says troublemaker. That's like my favorite, this one. Because Salesforce, this is one that I designed. I failed the CTA and all I got was this lousy t-shirt. It's a feature, not a bug. Keep calm and long live S controls. That was an old thing you could build on Salesforce. The CRUD father, which is about permissions, create, read, update, delete. You know, and you've got some kind of seasonal ones as well. So these are fantastic. You know, really good fun, and it's quite often that we see the dark side of the force. Someone's done a Pink Floyd one there, but you know, you see people at events wearing these t-shirts, and it's just a nice fun thing here. Fear and lightning with web components. Somebody did the forward-looking statements that Salesforce always show. You know, metadata. Run DML. There's loads of cool stuff here. That one's my favorite. Astro says relax. Anyway, so yeah, by all means have a little look at some of the stuff that, you know, some of the quirky parts of the community. When that's run successfully, I will go back into, yeah. So let's look at one that has failed. Silent flow, there we go. So I can see here, this is what was, you know, it looks very similar to what we had in the sandbox with this is what's in it. And we can see it failed. So we click view details and it will tell us why it failed. So you normally see the deployment fish here, like while it's running, and then it'll finish off with either a red circle or a green circle and the number of things that were deployed. And then here we get the error. So in the project edited process builder, which is actually a flow version, it says we can't find an action with the name and action type that you specified. So that broke. And then you've got assignment end dates from projects, required field is missing, assign next value to reference. So I went into my flow and just troubleshooted it, practiced it again, had a little look at things, went on Google. What I actually tend to do is Google the error messages. Because when I Google the error messages, I'm going to see someone else has had this as well, like around the same time. Required field is missing, assign next value to reference, and then you can look through what other people have had, what other issues people have had. So you can see that there's a few people that have had an issue here because it's in a summer 20 preview sandbox and we're trying to deploy to a spring 20 box. Now that's exactly what happened to me. And you can see the conversation is still going on. Now, this leads me on to the next important thing about sandboxes and production and releases. Salesforce, as I said, does 3 releases per year. When they actually release, when they deploy each release, they deploy it to everybody's sandboxes first. And they do it a good month or so before they're planning to release into everybody's production orgs. So you get a chance to play around with the new features. And we call that the Sandbox Previews. So what that means is that the version that Jessica has been looking at in this instance, she has a sandbox which is on the summer 20 release, because we're currently in the Sandbox Preview window, where they put the new release into her sandbox, but it's not due to come out into production just yet. So she's then built her flow based on on a new version of Salesforce, and it's not backwards compatible. So as she's trying to deploy her flow back into production, which is she's trying to deploy her flow into production, which is on a spring 20 release, there's obviously a feature that flow is looking at on the platform in the background that doesn't exist in the production yet. So what's the impact of that? She's probably going to have to wait until, if she's not, developer inclined, coding programmatically inclined, she might have to wait until the release goes into the production instance, which isn't great, but as an architect, we would look at that and go, well, what's the impact? Is it a big priority to get this flow in? Yes or no? And if it is a big priority, if it's business critical, then actually, if you follow the thread of this, you can see that there's a field missing from the flow's flow loop metadata, an issue with Summer 20. And somebody has actually had to go in and extract the metadata from the sandbox, put it in VS Code, manually change it to include that reference, and then redeploy it into the source org. And they've had to do that sort of behind the scenes in order for it to work. So he's had to manually modify that XML. So it's good to know that you can do that if your stakeholders do kick off because they don't want to wait 2 or 3 weeks for the new release, then that's fine. These things do happen sometimes, and it's just a matter of managing it. As I said before, Salesforce is a living, breathing system, and it's never, ever finished. Which leads me on to another method that you can use to deploy between environments. You can actually use, as I said earlier, you can use VS Code to extract the metadata and then upload it into a version control repository like GitHub, and you can manage the deployment of those releases using the branching strategies that are available in GitHub. Now, if you want to get more technical about that, as Ladies Be Architects, we can arrange for a branching strategy session to be run if that's something that you're interested in. But it's a way to enable multiple teams of developers to deploy to the same sandboxes without overwriting each other's stuff. So they merge their changes in with the changes of other people, and then they're able to run tests to check for any issues when 2 bits of code run together. Now, whether you code or whether you configure, you're still producing computer files in the background, and really that's what these strategies are working with, is a series of computer files. And as we looked at the outbound change sets earlier and we clicked view source, this is an example of the file that is produced in the background from you pointing and clicking and producing your flow. So this file has got to get copied somewhere and pasted somewhere else. And really that's what deployment is doing. It's copying and pasting files from one location on the internet to another location on the internet in a secure way. One other way you can do it is by using command line interface through Salesforce Dx. Now, full disclosure, I try and avoid DX. For me, it's not something I'm interested in learning. It's not something that I find easy to look at. I have completed a command line interface trailhead badge, and I probably wanted to hang myself at the end of it. And I just kind of looked at my friend and said, "You're a developer, can you just do it?" But if you do want to learn more about Salesforce Dx, then please knock yourselves out. There's plenty of stuff online about it, and you can use Terminal to spin up what's called a scratch org. And a scratch org is basically another way of producing little test throwaway playground orgs, so that you can test functionality and test deploy functionality as well. Are there any questions? I've been yakking away about change sets and sandboxes for the last 40 minutes. I'm going to pause there and just allow for any questions. A lot of this is theoretical. Okay, so I guess you're all okay then. So where does this all fit? Why do we even bother looking at sandboxes and scratch orgs and Salesforce Dx and testing and all of this sort of stuff? Well, it's all down to, you know, the way that we manage the life cycle of our application. In traditional on-premise software, what you might tend to do is to produce a release, you know, and what people used to do was, what companies used to do was to actually charge customers for the upgrade, for the new release. It wasn't included in their plans. And once the upgrade was in, that was it. That was how it worked. With something living and breathing like Salesforce, it becomes even more important to have a lifecycle management strategy. As I said, for governance, make sure that nothing gets out, so that your org doesn't get out of control. For minimizing the impact of changes. If you suddenly change a workflow rule while the users are in the system at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and all of a sudden something that they were able to do 2 minutes ago suddenly doesn't work anymore, that really can destroy the trust that your users have in the system and ultimately destroys adoption. So that's another huge risk. The cost of going over and fixing stuff that's been broken by people just building stuff willy-nilly straight in production, or deploying into production without checking it and doing any kind of quality assurance. You can never guarantee that your org is going to be manageable for an admin, which is going to increase their workload, which is going to reduce their morale, which is going to have a knock-on effect on users. You know, so just these simple things really do, it's all about people, this side of things. It's about making life easier for users and making the system more controllable for the business. And because it is primarily a business system. So in this change set development approach, what we talk about with ALM, Application Lifecycle Management, is how we plan our release. And there are different methodologies that people can use. Some projects and environments are less changeable. Things are quite static, or they have gone out and done a lot of analysis first of all, and they said, okay, we're going to split what we want to do with Salesforce into 4 different projects. And in this project, we're going to deploy opportunities, accounts, contacts, and leads. Then in the next project, we're going to introduce CPQ, configure, price, quote, which is advanced quoting tools. Then after we've got some data in, we will then roll out to the customer service team, and we'll look at case management and Service Cloud. And that's quite a typical program where it can be quite linear. And in those sorts of projects, they're the ones where, you know, where actually they've got to very carefully manage the adoption of Salesforce, and they're used to spending time to get things very, very, very right and very locked down before they go ahead and build, which is known as your sort of traditional waterfall approach. So in that sort of environment, your release planning actually happens because you're doing your analysis up front. So you're having workshops with stakeholders, ideally people from the sales organization, if it's a Sales Cloud implementation, people from finance, management who will want to see reports. You should ideally have some end users in there. And in that very linear waterfall approach, and lots of people say waterfall's old-fashioned and, you know, agile is the next best thing that we should be doing now. I actually think that it depends on the environment that you're working in. Some places just cannot do agile, and some places have done waterfall to the point where they've lost trust in it and they need to try something different. So you have to be able to understand, you need to be able to empathize with your clients and your team, your business team, to understand what is going to be the best way for you to show them that this system is valuable in the best possible way. So I don't actually think there is any right answer, right methodology to use. I think the right methodology to use is the instinct and the empathy that you bring to the project. So that in a waterfall environment, that release planning might look like a spec. We're going to configure accounts. They will have 5-page layouts. They will have 35 custom fields. 15 of them will be integrated from another system. 20 of those fields will be, the data from those fields will be sent off to the finance system, for example. And this integration will look like this. It will take this estimated amount of time. It's dependent on the data model being produced, and it will go in the project plan like that with all its dependencies. And then it goes on to somebody building it. In an agile situation, you write user stories. And user stories typically look like, okay, as a salesperson, I want to be able to record the fact that somebody has made an inquiry so that I can follow up with them afterwards. That's a business requirement, and it's very business and people focused. So if we break down that user story as a salesperson, so you immediately know who's involved, who's the actor, what is the reason that they have for needing this, what they've got a job to do. What is the job that they need to do? Well, they need to be able to capture the fact that someone was interested in a product or service so they can follow up afterwards. So if I break that down, that sounds to me like the word capture gives me a lot of creative license, because I can think about, okay, what are the possible ways that I could capture a lead for someone to follow up on? Well, a lead could visit the website. So I might need a web to lead form for them to put their details in. A lead could visit a website and be tracked through cookies, that they're visiting a website and they've accepted that those cookies exist to do that. So that's another route in. A person could phone in on the central switchboard and say, I'm interested in this and that. Can someone contact me, or can I speak to the right person? So that's another method. And that's just one sentence that has given me 3 potential things that I've got to configure for. The next thing is, how do I even track the fact that the follow-up needs to happen? Well, if I break this down further, if you think about the website example, when someone comes to the website and fills out a contact us form, you're capturing name and email address and company and all of that sort of stuff. How do you then make sure it goes to that person for review? Well, you create a lead assignment rule. And in order for that lead assignment rule to work, you've got to create a queue to assign it to. In order for it to be picked up by somebody, you've got to assign a user to the queue. How do they even know that it's come through? Well, you'll have to set up a follow-up task or notification of some description to actually help them see that the lead has come through. So from that one sentence, you've broken it down into a tree of different tasks that you split up, and they go into your release plan. And we call that your backlog. Your backlog is based on a user scenario. It is broken down into lower level stories. And then you get together as a team and you decide you have a product manager who decides how important is each of those stories. Is it fundamental for someone to use the system, and do we want to deliver it like in the next 2 weeks? Yes or no? And once that priority has been decided, sorry, crash course in Agile here. Once that priority has been decided, the team itself can add it to the backlog for what's called a sprint, which is like a 2 to 3 week period, very time boxed, which is the period in which stuff gets built. And they work their way systematically through that list of stories in priority order. And then at the end of that 2 weeks, that's what the customer gets. So those 2 methods are used to plan releases and to build. The building itself, we talk about development. Development isn't just about writing code. Many of us are point and click developers. You guys are point and click developers. That's what you spent the last 12 weeks doing. And, there are, depending on what your development operations approach is, this ALM diagram talks a lot about using version control software as the source of truth. And I don't want to go into an awful lot of detail on that, because that's a different topic and we could fill days with it. But the idea is that you align your sandboxes and scratch orgs with your testing and building that you're doing as you go. So as you're working on your user stories, or as you're working through your spec, you're configuring your objects, you're building your flows, you're building your reports and dashboards, and then you're going to deploy to, you'll be doing that in your own local sandbox, but then you're going to be deploying to another sandbox, which is where you pull everything together and check that it's not breaking everything. So we typically call that a QA or integration sandbox. Sometimes it's called a SIT sandbox, which is a systems integration testing sandbox. And we align the sandbox strategies with our testing strategies. So ideally, if you're going to build something, you should be testing it yourself straight away. So if you build a report, you want to be checking it against a requirement to make sure it's meeting that requirement before you then deploy it somewhere else for someone else to check. And this is just good practice, because there are lots of different ways that you can configure things in Salesforce, and it enables deploying to a quality assurance sandbox and having a peer check it for you if you're in a team is effective, because it enables discussion. And certainly if you work in an agile environment, agile is not a methodology, it's a set of principles, and those principles and working practices are based around trust. So in an agile Scrum environment, once you've picked up your ticket, once you've picked up your user story and you're going to deliver it, the rest of the team trusts you to deliver it the best way you know how. And if you've got any questions, you can ask each other. If you want to clarify things, you can ask the product manager. And the idea is that it builds self-efficient teams, self-organizing teams, basically, that run efficiently. And it means that once that individual person has built that functionality, someone else checks it, they have a discussion. Ultimately, when they're happy that it works as it should and that it meets the requirements, internally, then they're ready to release it to be tested. And that's the first part of the life cycle where a sample of your end users will get to see what you've built and test it. And they should be testing it in an environment of its own, where they can fiddle about with it as much as they need to. And it enables them to test different scenarios, different business scenarios, and to feed back to you to say, well, actually, I know I said this, but now I realize that I actually need to account for that as well. So it creates that continuous cycle of feedback, really. It's a great feedback loop so that you can keep changing things. Now, in a waterfall environment, that's not so easy because, well, ultimately it ends up happening with Salesforce anyway, but in a waterfall environment, you build, you finish the build, you do a review, and then you go straight to test. And you leave the users alone for like 2 weeks to test. And then at the end of that, you'll have some changes that need to be made as a result of the tests. You make those changes and then you deploy into production. And the only difference between that waterfall and approach, an agile approach, is that, once you've deployed and released that functionality, it tends to be a much larger release. You might be releasing an entire business process or several different business processes in one go. At that point, you then train and then your users go live. Whereas in an agile environment, you test and you look at how people raise a new story for as a result of a test taking place, and then it gets reprioritized. And sometimes things will drop into the next sprint in favor of this new fix being reprioritized. But the idea is that that's why it's called agile, is that you can shift the priorities in response to the business's needs, and then you just release. And the idea of agile as well is you release regularly. You release a little bit at a time regularly, and you make sure that what you're releasing is shippable. Well, that's what you're building is shippable. So you tend to start with the minimum amount of functionality just to get people used to it, because as they start getting used to it, they will then talk to the product manager and say, wouldn't it be great if it did this? And the product manager says, right, we've got a new story, I'm going to put it up on the board. Next thing you know, it goes into the sprint. What are we going to build? So that's the whole idea, is that you're continuously building against feedback. Now, if you want to know more about those methodologies, I can recommend Prince. If you go to Prince 2 and have a look at some of the resources there, that will teach you a lot about a lot of the principles of Prince 2, and there'll be some information there about waterfall and systems development lifecycle. That's what I learned at uni as well. And then on the Agile side, I can 100% recommend scrum.org. You go to scrum.org and it will talk to you about all the different roles that are involved in an Agile project. There's also some training that you can take part in, and it will just help you to understand a bit more about the role of sandboxes, and you can get certified, get some training on Scrum. You can become a Scrum Master, a product owner, and it just talks about what the framework is all about, and how and why it works in projects. And Salesforce is a really great example of how to apply Scrum, because it's a living, breathing system. Okay, so when you're ready, what people tend to do is you'll have a variety of different tools that you can use to manage your backlog. And typical tools that you can use to manage your backlog and your release plan is you can create. There's a tool called Jira that people use. Some of you may be familiar with that. Jira gets used quite a lot. You create a ticket. So rather than an issue, if you like, you create a ticket which represents your user story. And you can plan your stories, you can plan your issues, you can plan your sprints, and people use like a board scenario. So you tend to have 4 different columns, like this is to do, this is what's being done, this is what needs reviewing or QA, and then this is what's done. And you get together and decide what done really means, and then you can add in, these are the releases that you're about to and when they're going to come out. And then when you look at the release, you can actually see what stories are involved in the release. Build project plans, etc. So this is just an example of some of the tools that people use. You can also connect this to code repositories as well, and integrate your branching strategy with it. And you can extend it with loads of different apps as well, as you can see. And all of this Salesforce anyway. And you can do it on your phone. So it's very straightforward. Oh, I didn't even know you could use that. Anyway, for free. So that's just one example. There's loads of different tools out there to manage your backlog. And then when you're ready, when you're ready to prepare your releases, you need to be able to make sure that everyone can access all the environments that they need for every single step. So if you're using change sets, you need sandboxes, and you need sandboxes that are best fit for the tasks that you need to do. So in this example, we've got develop, test, build release, test release, and final release. Now this is quite a typically followed process. And if we work backwards, production is your live environment where everybody's in there using stuff. Your full sandbox is a copy of your live environment with all the data. That's where you want to do your dress rehearsal for your deployment, for your final release. So these two should be in sync by the time you're done. By the time you're ready to go into production. And by the time you're ready to go into production, ideally this will be quicker, because it will be, in an ideal world, fully tested by then. In reality, it doesn't always happen that way, especially when you're dealing with humans who don't always test. And then all of a sudden they're finally doing their UAT after it's gone live in production. Just a few times that's happened to me. You have your build release. So this is like your integration piece. Remember I talked about how you can use dev sandboxes. Everybody has their own dev sandbox, and then you can deploy into a developer pro or a partial copy. Ideally, that's where you want your users coming in and doing their testing. And then any feedback that comes out from that, they can log their feedback. Developers over here pick up the feedback, make changes, redeploy it back into this sandbox, so that by the time this is all signed off and your testing's signed off, you're actually doing a dress rehearsal release into the full copy sandbox and then adding your data. And once you've ironed out any issues with that, you can then just rinse and repeat for production. So he creates 2 developer sandboxes, one for himself and one for his colleague, Ella. standard story again. So in these sandboxes, Calvin and Ella create and test their respective customizations. And by creating one sandbox for each developer, Calvin keeps his changes isolated until the team is ready to integrate them. He can have sandboxes in Professional Edition, Enterprise Edition, and Unlimited and Performance editions of Salesforce. And he goes and creates a sandbox. Now, I already showed you how to do that. Then you've got to think about your change tracking method. You've got to track all the changes that you make. Now, this can be a little bit awkward. If you're only using change sets, the only real way to track all the changes that you make is either one, to manually migrate certain changes, because some things can't be included in metadata, can't be included in change sets. And what that means is, and I used to have to do this, was I used to create a Google Sheet, which every time I built something, I would log it in the Google Sheet. And then I would use the Google Sheet at the end, once everything was ready and the customer was happy and they'd done their testing, I would actually use that Google Sheet to build my change set, and then I would do the change set. It's not elegant. Whereas if you use the other approach where you're using Jira and you're integrating it with a Git repository, then you just check in your functionality into your branch, and then when everybody's happy with it, it gets merged into the main branch, and then the main branch is deployed into production. It just automates things and makes it a lot quicker. It's just a bit fiddly for those of us who don't code. There's a running joke, actually. I was working on a client about 7 years ago, and they joke, it was quite funny because it took me 30 minutes to check in a custom field, and in the end I was just like, I just don't want to do this. I just don't want to do this. You guys all have to do it. I'll list what I've done, you go and get it. And they were like, okay. Because it does require certain skills, which I don't have or want. So metadata coverage report is something that you can use to see what metadata types are supported. Now, the metadata API is the channel that Salesforce uses to deploy between environments. And some things are not supported. So things like user interface settings that you might make through the setup menu, those have to be manual. Things like enabling person accounts, that has to be done in a systematic way that involves Salesforce support switching it on, and you basically, declaring legally that you're okay for them to do that. Calvin's actually created a custom tool that allows developers to log each change that they make. And he's actually said, who's making the change? Does it need to be done manually? Are there any other components that are impacted by the change? Which orgs currently have it? And when was the change made in each environment? To be honest, I actually also just used to do, in my simple spreadsheet, it would be, what's the label? What's the API name? What type? What kind of item is this? Is it a field? Is it an object? Is it flow definition? If it's a field, are there any pick list values I need to know about? Are there any validation rules sitting over the top of it? And are there any dependencies? And I ended up with this great big long sheet, in some instances, full of config that I could just, manually eyeball check between the two. So why does he track changes made in production when they're not part of a release in development? Well, that's because sometimes you might need to make minor changes in production to reports or to list views, or you're changing search layouts or compact layouts, just very, very quick minor changes that are low impact. You need to know about these because you can end up accidentally overwriting them. If you deploy a page layout, if let's say a page layout gets changed in production and you've got a completely different page layout in Sandbox, and then you upload the new page layout from Sandbox up to production, you're overwriting that change that was made in production completely. So you need to know about that. That's another reason that people use Git repositories and branching, because it means that if changes are made to metadata in production, you can sync that down into your other branches, into everybody else's branches, and they can test against it. This, again, is so important because it's the reliability of this business system. If people are seeing things just changing willy-nilly, they can't trust it. So it's really, really important that they can trust this system. Almost every change that is made is logged in the setup audit trail. I'm going to go and show you that. quickly. It's bloody useful. In the sandbox, I'm going to show you. If you go into the setup menu and just start typing setup, it might take a week. There is a thing called, under security, it's called view setup audit trail. Every time somebody makes a change to an item of metadata that is tracked, you get a full view of what they've been doing, and it tells you what they did. So if there's some kind of disaster, you can actually pinpoint what happened and give support, and hopefully not shout at anyone. And you can download it into CSV file as well, because you only get a certain amount of history looking at this page, and if you want to see more history, you have to download it into a CSV file. And you can see here what I've been doing. I've been playing around with flows. I've done lots of different versions of my flows. I've created new workflow rules. I've activated certain flows. There's loads of stuff that I've been doing there, and it just gives everybody, a way of finding out, especially because this is a cloud system, and if you've got multiple system administrators, it's a way of just understanding what people are doing in there. And you can actually, the beauty of having it in Excel is also that you can filter. So there was a report that I used to have to run for compliance purposes when I was at D&B. I had to look at who logged in which admins logged in as users, so that you could see, if there's any history of a record being updated or a field being changed that perhaps shouldn't have been changed, you can see for certain who was logged in as that user at the time, because as an admin, you can log in as users. So there's all kinds of things here that you can filter by. So you can look at, was there any Apex running? Well, what I've done here is I actually installed a managed package for Zoom. So I could kick off Zoom calls through my sandbox because I was testing it. Did I want to enable any feed tracking? Yes, I did that. Did anyone customize any leads? Well, I created some buttons, so you get the idea. Like validation roles as well. I created one there, and changes to pages. They were all the page changes that I did. It tells you when, tells you what time, tells you who did it. So there's loads of very important audit information that's maintained. Now, there was a quiz there. It seems to. I don't think I can retake it. So I don't think I'll be able to do that one. No, I'll have to do it in incognito. So let's go to incognito. How are we doing for time? 20 minutes to go. Is this all helping everybody? You're all very quiet and listening intently. It's quite heavy stuff, but it's mostly because it's all people related. I've always joked that everything's fine until you get people involved. Let's have a look at this challenge then. So why is it important to track changes made during development? A, to identify what should go in a change set. B, to generate a metadata coverage report. C, to eliminate the need for manual deployments. And D, to know which components are supported in Metadata API. What do we think? Oh, do you know what? I've not even scrolled down to the bottom of the chat. You've probably all been chatting and I've just missed it. Oh, yes, there are questions. Okay, I'll come to your questions in a moment. Question number 2. What makes a developer sandbox a good choice for development over other types of sandboxes? A, it provides access to production data. B, it's a good UAT environment. C, it allows developers to keep release changes isolated. Or D, it contains developer tools not available in other sandboxes. What do we think, guys? Okay, I'm going to answer your questions now that I've scrolled down and I can see them all. So Afshan said, will the users have the same access as that of production, and our users object automatically carried to Sandbox, or do we create it? The users will have the same access in Sandbox as they have in production at the time when the Sandbox is refreshed. So it will copy over all your permission set assignments as well and your profile settings. If you then go and change them in the Sandbox, it will, you know, your user setup will be left as it is in production. Okay. Jeremy says, what is your opinion on third-party deployment tools like GearSet and Copado? Honestly, knock yourself out. Some of them are absolutely brilliant. Like, I was sat watching a demo jam at a conference last year, and GearSet won it. And their presentation, I was just sat there going, oh, look at the pretty things. Because it actually enables you to run your backlog and deploy and link all your config to each story and deploy that way. It is so good. So if your organization is lucky enough to afford GearSet or Copado, then I would look at it for definite, yes. Some of them are very cool. I've just unfortunately not had the chance to play with them yet, sadly. So, because ultimately it's my client's decision as to whether they buy it or not. Okay, so next step, develop and test changes locally. Okay, so once they finish their planning, they move to the next stages where they're developing and local testing. When I say local testing, it means that they're testing their own stuff. So if you're going to build something like a validation rule, please test it first before you ask someone else to test it, and just be confident that it's in line with the requirement that you have in front of you. Now, I actually want to run a separate session about requirements, and I'm going to do that outside of this course. I've wanted to do something like a live session on requirements and how to break them down for quite some time. So I'm going to post that, which means I basically am committing to doing it, or at least organizing it, how to break them down. Done. So he creates 2 custom objects. So he's got a language course object and a language course designer object. He's created all these objects and he's defined the fields, and he's going to create his outbound change set. Remember, we had a look at that. And I've actually already taken you through all this. That's great. So he goes through and he creates his change set, adds them to the change set. But before he can actually upload it, what does he need to do? Anyone guess? What does he need to do to upload his change set to the target org, which would be production? Validate. What's he validating? So he's got his metadata, he's created his change set, he's added his metadata to the change set. Hopefully he's added his profiles. How does Salesforce know where to upload the change set to? What do you have to do first? And where? That's right, Jeremy. You have to create connections between orgs. So you have to go to your target organization and you have to go to deployment settings, and you have to tell the target organization that it's okay to accept inbound changes, and that creates the connection between the orgs. So he has to go and do that. When he's done that, he can upload the change set. Now, after you've uploaded it, you're not going to be able to change it. So if you've missed something, you've got to go back into your sandbox, clone the change set, add what's missing, and then re-upload it. And that's really important to remember that. Although, to be honest, because you'll get validation rules, you won't be able to do anything with it anyway. So that's just naturally the next thing that you do. Once the change sets are in the developer sandbox, Pro Sandbox, the team can move on to the integration testing. So based on what there we go. So based on what you've learned in this session from me just yakking away, Question number 1, when is it necessary to clone a change set? A, to use a new deployment connection authorized after the change set has already been uploaded. B, to modify its contents after it has been uploaded to a target org. C, to upload it to a different org. D, to delete a component in the target org. Or E, A and B. You think it's A and B. So to use a new deployment connection authorized after the change set has already been. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think it's E as well. Question number 2, which step must Calvin perform to transfer a change set from one sandbox to another? A, authorize a connection in the sandbox accepting the change set. B, unlock the change set in the sandbox uploading the change set. C, refresh the sandbox that's accepting the change set. And D, verify that the change set contains all dependent components. What do we think, guys? A, but should also do D. You should do D, but do you have to do it in order to transfer the change set? No. You should do it, but it's not impacting directly whether the change set can be transferred or not. C, refresh the sandbox. I think it's actually A. You have to authorize the connection first before you can do anything else. Okay, people, give it a go. And finally, test in the integration environment and deploy changes. So remember that they've deployed into this integration environment because both Calvin and Ella have got their own sandboxes, and they need to verify that their changes actually work together and that they don't break anything that's already there. We call that regression testing. Regression testing is so verifying that changes work together and not breaking anything. That is regression testing. But also the missing step here, I think, is that Calvin should be checking Ella's design, should be checking Ella's and just testing it manually, and Ella should be checking Calvin's as well. So after they're done with these tests, Calvin builds a final release artifact, which is a new outbound change set that contains all of their changes. So that's 2 change sets merged into one. They run a final sanity check with this new artifact to make sure they've captured all their changes, and they finally plan and execute the deployment to production. So the developer Pro Sandbox that they've both deployed to now has both inbound change sets. So he goes through the release tracking log, checks the deployment, and if there's any manual deployment steps that are needed, he's got to go and fix those. He's got to go and switch those on first. So if he's got to go and turn some settings on or switch some off, he's got to go and do that now. So he plans it carefully. He's going to deploy his change set. He's going to deploy Ella's change set, and he's going to manually assign permission sets to allow users to access the app. So he deploys his change set. He goes to the inbound change sets and he clicks validate. Actually, they've just jumped straight to deploy, but click validate first because that will help you. If the deployment cannot complete successfully for any reason, everything just rolls back. So the change set doesn't get through at all. So even if some parts of your change set have managed to go over successfully, it's an all or nothing job. So you've either got to remove the faulty bits, or you've got to just, or you've got to fix it. If it completes successfully, all changes are committed to your org and you can't go back. So in order to get rid of your new stuff, you have to go and physically delete it in your target org. So to finish it, he then deploys Ella's change set, then performs the manual migration steps. I would do it that way too. Test with other change sets. So with everything in place, they then do some testing, make sure both sets of changes work together and don't break anything that's already there. The team has then got to fix and address any issues that they find, so he can make changes in the Developer Pro Sandbox directly. However, spanner in the works, the team's process, so there's policies in play here, dictate that the Developer Pro Sandbox is only for integration and testing of multiple change sets. So they can't make changes directly in that sandbox. They could, but they shouldn't. So they decide to go back into their own sandboxes and fix any changes that need to be done in that developer sandbox. Then they're going to create a new change set, and they're going to re-upload it to the integration sandbox, and then they're going to test again and make sure it's working correctly. This is best practice. So they set up authorizations between the developer sandboxes and the Developer Pro, because once they've deployed down, that's interesting. So what they've actually done is they refresh their developer sandboxes after they've deployed. That's interesting. Anyway, I probably wouldn't have done that, but it depends on the situation. Set up authorizations, and they follow the steps and they deploy the changes from each of their dev sandboxes back into the Developer Pro sandbox. So there's a couple more things he's got to do. He creates his change set in the Developer Pro, so the integration sandbox, where everything's fixed, and it's got all the new components that were in the integrated change sets that came in with the fixes in them. Then he deploys that change set to the full copy sandbox, which is his UAT org. That could, in some instances, be a partial copy sandbox. In this instance, they're using it as a UAT org, user acceptance testing. So the team performs one last round of tests just to make sure that everything's done, that the changes work as expected and nothing else is broken. I would probably call that a smoke test, just to make sure, does it work? It's because you're not testing whether it meets the requirement, you're testing whether it works, or QAing whether it works. So then he gets some users to come in and try it out. So he's got so those users come in and they go, well, that's going to work well for me, or the experience needs to change here. So then if there are changes that come out of that UAT experience, what Calvin and Ella need to be doing next is making those changes in their developer sandboxes and then making new change sets to deploy up to the Developer Pro, the integration sandbox. So unfortunately, it means going round and round in circles, but it's worth it to make sure that the app is fit for purpose and that there's no regression. So when everything's, and I love how they just skip that, recruit some users to try it out, skip. When everything works, Calvin prepares to roll out the new app. This is obviously a real happy path here, because in this instance, the users are all extremely happy with what they've built. So he's going to authorize a new deployment connection from the developer sandbox he clones the change set he deployed to the full sandbox. Okay, yeah. So he's actually going straight from Dev Pro up to production. In this instance, I would probably, once my users are happy in the full sandbox, I would actually have created my change set from the full sandbox into production and not from Developer Pro. But it's just preference. There are pros and cons to all of them, and there is no absolutely right way of doing it. You have to figure out what's best for the team that you're working with, and the regularity of the changes and the complexity of the changes. So he uploads his change set, he validates his change set in production, and once he's happy that it's going to deploy, because remember, validating a change set is a practice deployment, and sometimes things can break going between sandbox and production when perhaps it was okay before then, because there's more data in production, and if there is code being deployed, then there are other requirements for code. You can't build code directly in production. If you write code, Apex classes, Visual Force pages, Lightning components, they have to be built in a sandbox and then promoted up to production, and tests run. And what the tests are doing is making sure that your code covers over 78%, I think it is now, of the records in production that need it. So that's really, really important for developers. Once he's uploaded it into production, he's going to wait. He's going to plan out when he's going to deploy it. He can't deploy it when lots of people are in the system, because all of a sudden, some of those changes will lock some of the deployment might lock users from doing stuff. So it's best practice to wait for a time when the usage is light. Don't deploy on a Friday, because if you think, oh, I'll deploy and then go home at 4 o'clock, that's your weekend gone. So what we tend to actually, I've seen multiple strategies for this. I was talking to someone the other day who was doing a big deployment on a Thursday so that they've got Friday to fix any issues that come in. I'm actually pretty okay with deploying over the weekend, so that on Monday morning everything's there, but that can lead to some very, very long hours, depending on what you're having to do. I once did a project where I had to remove an app exchange package. Well, I had to remove a bunch of custom objects. Sorry, export the data, remove a bunch of custom objects, remove a load of dependencies from managed package, uninstall the managed package, deploy some code that would replace the functionality of some of the functionality of the managed package and some new stuff. Then I had to redeploy all the old custom objects, of which there are about 150 of them. I then had to put all the data back. And then I had to install, and then I had to run checks, and it took all weekend, and it took 3 of us. It was just a huge, huge, huge job. And the funny thing is they all got back in on Monday, and they were like, "Oh, great, got a new system live." And I was like, "Is there any problems?" "No, everything's fine, thanks." Thank God for that. Anyway, it can take a long time. You need a lot of pizza and beer to do it. So anyway, so he's going into his developer Pro Sandbox. He's cloning the outbound change set, and he's connecting it to production. He's validating it, and he's making sure that that everything's going okay. Now, when you validate a change set, it locks all the resources that are being deployed, so you can't make any admin changes that are locked. So, for God's sake, do your validations and your deployments during off-peak usage hours. So once everything's gone into production, even if his validation has been successful and he's managed to deploy, fix your error messages. The most common cause of errors is the dependent components that are not included in the change set. So this is why you need to use your view and add dependencies button smartly. And then finally, check and retest in production. That's your final production test. That's to check that everything's gone over correctly, that it is working the same way it did in the sandbox when you had it signed off. And celebrate that it's gone live. And then next thing you know, you're back in sprint planning again, ready to plan the next lot. Woohoo! So, just to finish this bit off, question number 1: why does Calvin validate the change set? A, to upload a change set to a testing org. B, to perform a change set deployment dry run. C, to add a change set to the awaiting deployment list. Or D, to make sure it doesn't contain malicious content. Any ideas? Jason says B, Jeremy says B. So to perform a change set deployment dry run. Okay. Question number 2, what is a common reason for the failure of a deployment of a change set? A component within the change set has been misnamed. B, a deployment connection hasn't been authorized in the source org. C, the validation process was skipped. Or D, a dependent component has not been included in the change set. Okay, we're saying D. Do you want to give it a go? Can I get a woohoo if you've got confetti? I'm watching eagerly. Did we get confetti? Okay, well, thank you everybody again for attending this evening. Much appreciated. I hope you found this useful. I will put this diagram into the course notes and upload the video, and I will get you some homework to do on application lifecycle management. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you do want to watch some more stuff about this, if you go to YouTube, there's a channel called Ladies Be Architects. It's the non-profit learning organization that I'm part of. And we have a video on there that's all about governance and sandbox management. Let me just stop the little trailer that it runs. It always runs our little joke trailer. In a world, which Susanna and her other half very kindly put together. We have all kinds of stuff in here that you might find useful, where we talk about things like master data management, single sign-on, enterprise architecture. There's also a piece on here about, it's under development lifecycle. Where's the development lifecycle one? There's a playlist in here, which is called Development Lifecycle and Deployment Designer. Somewhere along here. Oh no. Okay, videos then. So we have single sign-on, authentication types, social sign-on, environment management. This is the one. So that is me. I just had a different name.
Writing's not that easy. But
this session is all about sandboxes, org strategy, sandboxes, release management concepts to help you study for this exam. You know, and we just every month we produce new videos about various Salesforce platform features. So if you wanted to have a look at this, then by all means do feel free. I will post a link to this onto the site as well if you want to know more. So thank you, my lovelies, and I will speak to you in 2 days' time. Enjoy the rest of your day and take care, and I hope you enjoyed this. Thank you.